Hello. Huh? Sorry? Sorry, very quick.
Yeah.
We welcome everyone to the semi-finals of the IMU Debate Open. On the motion, this House believes that Israel should not declare itself a Jewish state. We invite the Prime Minister to open the case of
The yardstick of this debate is extremely simple. We think this debate is about the interest, what is in the best interest of Israel, and whether or not it is beneficial for them to identify or declare itself as a Jewish state. We think that the stance of side government is extremely simple. We think that if we continue to identify ourselves as a Jewish state, what happens is that it will tie its national identity to its political outlook, and what happens is that the Jewish faith will not be divorceable to its decision-making calculuses when it comes to, as opposed to when Israel is considered or identified as a secular state. Two arguments for you today. Number one, why Israel should remain secular to retain its relevance with the common Israelite or mainstream Israelite rather? And secondly, what is in the best interest of the people and Israel in general? So firstly, let's understand that when it comes to understanding the Knesset, or when it comes to understanding Israel, what happens is oftentimes it is considered an extremely right-wing government. What happens when you talk about this is that it's also increasingly there's an increase in proliferation of far right-wing ideologies when it comes to the preaching and propagating of things such as a siege mentality. When you look at people when you look at parties such as the Likud party, or even people such as Naftali Naftali Bennett, what happens oftentimes these people preach things such as siege mentality, or that they are victims in general, and we think that's far problematic in general. I'll argue to do that later. As a consequence, what happens in the Nasser is that the discussions in the parliament primarily revolve around things such as continuous geopolitical issues and such as defense and security, rather than and intensely tied to the Jewish mentality of victimhood. What happens is that the Jewish identity is oftentimes a narrative of victimhood, rather than and is placed upon by the annals of history, rather than any other issues that happen. The increasing Jewish identity has also failed to maintain relevance to actual domestic policies and plans. What happens is people are often sick and tired of us identifying as Jews and us identifying that we are Jews and we are under attack, and that's very problematic. That's the kind of focus that Israel and the Nasser is often placing in things such as geopolitical issues and things like this. People want to be able to solve things like the public debt in Israel. There's 90% right now, and nobody is able to solve the fiscal problems that Israel currently has. More importantly, things such as expensive universities that people cannot have access to are things which are problematic. But yet, the Nasser continues to focus on right-wing mentality, things such as defense, such as security, such as how we are often a victim of the Middle Eastern state in general. So we think that's a problem. As a result, there's a complete apathy of the system, and nobody really trusts what happens there. We think there's a problem with that. Before that,
don't you think that Israelis feel that they are under siege because, well, they are under siege?
Israel is under siege, but their siege mentality can be divorced from their religion in general. I'll explain to you that later. Secondly, let's argue on why it's the best interest of the people and Israel in general. We think that as long as Israel continues to proliferate its Jewish identity, what happens is that the conflict in the Middle East will continue to be or seen as a religious one. The idea that is a Jewish against other forms of ideologies which is in place. What happens when it's seen as a war of religion and war of ideologies rather than a simple issue of geopolitical concerns. What happens is oftentimes people, where the blame on Israel is often going to be cultural supremacy, and the Jewish state is often seen as the proliferator of cultural supremacy. We think that what happens is that Israel why should we be able to actually provide things such as divorce ourselves from the Jewish identity, is that we think that Israel's position in the Middle East should be one that's legitimate. It's not something that's just as trivial as a religious war, and not as something that's just a battle of identities. It's more than that. We think Israel's position in the Middle East is very, very legitimate, and that's something that the international arena has continued to ignore simply because it is something that is seen as a religious war or religious conflict. We think because it is considered a religious conflict, things such as international apathy or things such as international support is far less compared to if we identify ourselves as a secular or a state divorced from the Jewish identity, and we think that's important, both said. So what are the security concerns that we're talking about? This is important, so listen up. Number one, the fact that they are surrounded by a bunch of hostile countries and hostile states means that there are legitimate concerns when it comes to fighting, and when it comes to the hostile situations that are in the geopolitical concern. But secondly, people in the world expect it to give up things such as the West Bank simply because they think they are of concern. But more importantly, when you consider it from the non-religious point of view or non-Jewish state point of view, it is actually the West Bank is actually a very important vantage point for the other people. When you give up the West Bank, what happens is oftentimes Hamas has her vantage point when it comes to launching missiles and launching things into the state, which is very harmful to the kinds of people that exist within the Jewish state. So when you identify the entire conflict simply as one as of religion and not something that's of feasibility and importance to the geopolitical arena, you don't have that kind of support, and you don't have that kind of apathy towards the real identity of the Jewish state, or the Israel rather, than compared to the absence of one. But before that, yes.
Sir, don't you think despite declaring themselves a Jewish identity, they've always justified the international position based on geopolitical
No, but
for example, they say they want to self-defense, they want to prevent terrorists from spreading on.
No, but the justification is based on how they often identify as well as a Jewish state, right? So if we divorce ourselves from this, what happens is at the very least, we will get people identifying with how there's legitimate concerns with with Israel, rather than just saying that, hey, that's a religious problem, so we don't think that we should really meddle around with those issues because we can't really understand it in the first place. So in order for us to make sure that to a certain extent people understand that this is not a war of religion and not a war of different ideologies, we need to separate ourselves as Israel, separate ourselves from this identifying ourselves as Jewish state, so in order to move on. The problem with Israel is a big one, and it's in order for us to better understand it and better create the awareness of Israel and its struggles, we need to make sure that we are playing in a level playing field. And if we don't do that by divorcing ourselves with the Jewish identity, we fail to allow individuals of other places to do the same thing. This important motion must absolutely stand.
We invite the leader of opposition next to start the opposition.
We believe this tie to the mentality that Jewish is always victimized is because it is true, members of the House. The Jews themselves are being victimized throughout the world, and later I'll prove to you why in certain countries such as Syria and Iraq and stuff, the minorities are the Jews, and they are being victimized in this kind of situations. Today I have two arguments for you, right? First of all, why is it necessary to provide them security? And second of all, why is it important for them to have an ethnic identity? But before that, let's look on to some arguments, right? So let's look. Like they said that when you establish this kind of Jewish state, that they will now always relate their problems based on religion itself and not because of this kind of geopolitical, right? But we believe that's not true. We believe that even if they identify themselves as a Jewish state, we believe that before they always justify their international status with the geopolitical state of the country itself, right? They always talk about their right to self-defense, to prevent terrorist attacks, and so on and so forth. We believe this argument itself is not legit. And we also believe that we believe that we have to tie themselves, we have to show to the world that they are being victimized in order to actually improve the state of life that they are having right now. Before you can go on to all this kind of education, before you go on to all how this tertiary education is expensive and so on, first of all, you have to restore their status itself, right? You have to actually, you have to make it better for them to at least live properly without being victimized in all situations, right? And we also believe that people always attack them. People will not start to just attack them because they're just a Jewish state, but people always find excuse to attack them because of their religion, right? This excuse will always exist. This, no matter if the Jewish state is established or not, people will always find problems because of their religion itself. And we believe that it's ridiculous if you want to separate the ties right now, right? Because even without this kind of establishment of state, the religion cannot be thrown at the end of the day. So let's look onto the first argument. Sit down, Tim. Why is it necessary to provide them security, right? The creation of Jewish states of Israel has foundation within the continuous oppression of Jewish people throughout the century. We believe right now, why is it particularly important for them to actually stamp off the Jewish state with Israel itself, is because this is the motivation for them to do that, right? Without Israel, they won't, for example, if they took a blank state itself, they wouldn't have this kind of motivation. That's why it's particularly important for them to use Israel itself to establish this kind of Jewish states, because of the relations and ties that people have with this kind of states itself, right? So we believe that it cannot be achieved if Israel itself is a complete blank state without identity, because the narrative of creation of Israel stems from sense of the belonging of Jewish people have from that particular nation itself. That's why it is very important that we use Israel itself and not any kind of other states at the end of the day. So why is creation of Israel state important, right? 3 reasons for this. First of all, it's to compensate them for the intergeneration loss suffered because of ethnic persecution, right? Like all this kind of ethnic cleansing, them being targeted itself, always targeted just because of their religion. We believe when you at least when you have this kind of Jewish state, they have a safe haven there, right? They can actually escape. They have a form of escapism that they can just go to this Jewish state. At least they will get protection from here, right? At least they wouldn't be a target of all this kind of ethnic cleansing itself. Second of all, right, to give security, because they have been through hundreds of years of them being disapparated without a government actively fighting for that. What do you mean, right? Like the Rohingya itself, they don't have a government fighting for their rights. They're all dispersed all over the world, right? This is the same with the Jews. But once when you actually collect them and once you actually put them at one place, then it'll be easier to fight for all this kind of right, right? After you correct the mentality of them being victimized, after you provide a safe haven, then you can fight for the rights of education and so on and so forth. We believe that before you fight for this kind of rights, you need the establishment of this Jewish state itself to legitimize all these kinds of intention. Third reason, to give the Jews in Israel a regular means to live out their life in accordance to the Jewish identity itself, right? To practice their religion safely, because if in other places we all know that they have this kind of certain discrimination against them, and therefore this actually affects themselves from practicing all the kinds of religious based cultural things that they want to practice because of that itself. So we see, like, why is it actually important for them to have? But before that, yes.
We're talking about one of the biggest economies in the world. This is not the oppression that they suffered post-Nazi era. This is about the oppression that they also caused as a Jewish state. If the problems that they cause are related to the race, and as opening out pointed out, we should divorce that. Why should they continue to be recognized as a Jewish state?
We believe at the end of the day, when you put them at a scale of balance, right, like their problems, the problems that always arises from their political outlook will always be tied back towards their religious standings and so on and so forth. And at the same time, when you do not have the kind of establishment of this kind of states, people would always target them because they relate them back to Israel itself. They relate all these kind of Jews to the standings of the political people that the Israel have itself. On the scale of balance, when you actually at least establish a safe haven for them, at least all these kind of people can escape from this kind of degree of discrimination and run towards this kind of country, right? At the end of the day, on a scale of balance, under our paradigm, at least you provide this kind of protection from these people, of these Jews, from the discrimination of the world itself. On to the second argument, why is it actually important for them to have an ethnic identity? On to the first level, right? First level is importance of ethnic identities. Like, it's very important because countries surrounding them have already like either an ethnic identity or a religious identity. Why is it important? This was what I was talking about when the minority of Jews in the country is extremely being discriminated or persecuted, such as in Syria and Iraq, right? They can't live normally, like they can't even go out to have an education because they're always being victimized, or you're always going to be villainized by these people, because these people at these other countries believe that they are the fault of all these kind of deaths and so on, just because of their religion, right? Whether or not the establishment of Jews, even without the establishment of Jewish state, they will still be discriminated at the end of the day. So, like, why do we actually relate back to Israel is because the Jewish bond is extended beyond the national borders of the Israel itself, right? So establishment of the Jewish state means that there would be a constitutional provision facilitating the acceptance of Jews into Iraq and Syria as Israel citizens. As the minorities itself, there would actually as a minorities, at least there would be a constitution to facilitate them coming here, right? It provides us a second chance for them, for the Jews who are suffering, to find a safe haven. On to the second level, like even if the Arabs, the minorities in the Israel would be discriminated, we believe that's not a big problem because they can run to the neighboring countries who have the kind of identity and be protected there itself, right? And we don't, like, let's not exaggerate, they would still have the right to go to school and so on and so forth. That's why we believe it's important for the creation of the Jewish state.
Yeah.
Thank you for the session. We next to the
The failing of side-opening opposition is to identify why things like security, a safe haven for Israelites, how the compensation for whatever was wrong to them is intrinsically tied to a Jewish identity and not just a secular state. Because Israel can do all these things without identifying themselves as a Jewish state and still provide a way for the Jewish individuals to practice their religion. They can still provide safety for Jewish people that enter Israel. They can still be a safe haven from people who are coming from Iraq or Syria, as you so-called claim. But that identity as an overarching principle of how you choose to determine yourself as a Jewish state is completely irrelevant to the provision of those things, Mr. Chair. And we think that's the failure on that side of the house. A secular state of Israel can still be able to compensate all those things and provide all those things, and that's where the failing of side-opening opposition lies. I'm going to look at, my positive material for this debate is simple. I'm going to talk to you about why calling themselves or labeling themselves a Jewish state legitimizes the kinds of legitimizes the employment of rhetoric from neighboring hostile nations that makes it more legitimate for them to say that this is about combating Jewish interests or Jewish influence within the Middle East. Secondly, I'm going to talk about what happens to Jewish people who don't live in Israel and the repercussions on them when Israel does identify itself as a Jewish state. Before that, a couple of rebuttals and things that they didn't or conveniently forgot to rebut. The first thing they came up here and generally said was that we need to compensate for how they were ethnically targeted for providing and then provide them safety. I've already told you how any state or secular state can do the same thing without generally calling itself Jewish. But the problem then also becomes that when you come up here and you tell me that you want to compensate them for the ethnicity and the security, we don't see why Israel is the best choices around the world to be a safe haven for many of these individuals. But the second problem is that they assume that the average Israeli on the street is a far-right nut job that's only concerned about the security issues that plague Israel. Not true. The fact that political participation in Israel is below 30% is appalling. The fact that people's trust in governments and its approval rate is sinking below anything is appalling. The fact that the average man on the street has long forgotten and doesn't identify himself as the man that was then persecuted for the fact that he was Jewish is long gone. The average Israeli on the street right now cares about his day-to-day living, the fact that he needs a job, the fact that he needs security, and what's the best way to provide that, not just from a Jewish perspective, but the fact that he is any ordinary man. That's why Jewish people around the world aren't persecuted for being Jewish. Israelites are persecuted for being Jewish because of the way they carry themselves within the Middle East. And therefore, that argument falls. So the fact that they haven't rebutted this idea that the Jewish government Israeli government is losing traction with its own domestic populace simply because it is continued to be more progressively far right. It's continued to be focused more on things like whether or not the Iron Dome defense system is necessary, is problematic, and therefore we think it's not good. So if Israel fails to identify and fix its domestic issues, we think it's only going to lose traction among its domestic populace. That's why we think they haven't rebutted. The second thing they came up here and said is that the reason why the Jewish identity doesn't matter in the way Israel functions is that it doesn't change how Israel justifies itself as this is all about self-defense. But it's extremely contradictory when Israel goes up there and overarches itself as a Jewish state about Jewish interests. It begs the question, what happens if you're not Jewish within Israel? The fact that so many Palestinians live within Israel is also a question there. So the problem then becomes the fact that you identify yourself puts the liability of all of Israel's state on the Jewish faith. And that's where we think it becomes problematic when you correlate the Jewish faith with the acts of oppression that happens. The problem here becomes when you fail to identify that Israel has legitimate reasons why it doesn't want to give up certain pieces of land, it's certain legitimate reasons why it does certain things. But you don't want to equate its overacts of aggression to the Jewish faith. That's an unfair representation of how Jews work and how Jews should be represented within that country. And that kind of nuance and specificity that kind of international traction that Israel requires will never be given if it identifies itself as purely a state of Jewish interest that accommodates Jewish ideologies of Jewish people, Mr. Speaker. That's the kind of support we think Israel lacks. Again, not rebutted coming from Prime Minister. The third thing I want to come here and tell you, this is where my new material comes in, is why this legitimizes the employment of hostile tactics from neighboring states. We think the problem here, when Israel identifies itself as a Jewish state among obviously a country neighboring states of Muslim or Islamic faith, especially ones that are extremely militant, is you give other countries a reason to be more defensive about the way they look at political strategies or the kinds of tactics they employ in war, in the way they are aggressive towards Israel. The fact that you are no longer just another state, another secular state that lives within the Middle East, you are now one that is interested in the propagation of the Jewish identity, makes it that much harder for countries like Iran or Syria to accept them as part of people, part of a country that stays within the Middle East. What's the problem here? That means when it continues to propagate the Jewish identity, the only result of this is that this means more kinds of acts of aggression comes out from neighboring states because they feel like they need to counterbalance this huge Jewish narrative that is coming out from Iglis. They feel even more defensive, and countries around the have the same siege mentality where they refuse to negotiate, and there's no conclusive balance towards towards neighboring relationships. And therefore, we think in order for Israel to absolve itself of responsibility in the acts that it has conducted, or at least give itself more legitimacy, what it needs to do is not feed into that rhetoric that we need to counterbalance the Jewish rhetoric. Because we think that if that happens, then the sympathy that Israel gets in the international arena is far lower than it otherwise would, because they would be seen as playing into the cards of the extremists who want to be able to find a reason to fire rockets at Israel. And there we say is the actual problem. Before I go on, yes.
In this status, regardless of whether or not they declare themselves, they're also going to be perceived as a nation of Jews. When you're in that kind of situation, don't you think it's more forthcoming for them to represent themselves as what they truly are?
Okay, there are two problems with that. One, but in the assessment of whether or not you think you're at blame, the fact that you identify yourself as a Jewish state doesn't absolve you from any liability from the actions that you did. Which means if you tell yourself, we're not here for Jewish rhetoric, we're not here for Jewish interests, we're here to survive as a state, and people are targeting us because we are Jewish, we think that's where you actually get the upper hand in the traction you build. If you say we are openly Jewish and we only care about Jewish interests, then we think the sympathy there is far lower. And that's where we see the problem lies in opening opposition. The last argument here is what happens when it comes to Jews among countries around the world. We think the problem here is that when Israel becomes the only real representation of what the Jewish faith is and continues to propagate Jewish faith, there are two things that happen. One, you make life extremely difficult for all the Jewish individuals who practice the Jewish faith around the world, simply because they are keen to the very same atrocities that Israel has committed within the Middle East because it claims to propagate the kinds of Jewish faith and Jewish interests. We think that makes the same kinds of living for Jewish individuals within other countries that much harder. Not only is it a principal violation or principal harm of people not being able to represent their faith properly, it tangibly reduces the kinds of welfare that other Jewish individuals around the world live. For all these reasons, we're very proud to propose.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister. We invite the Deputy Opposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, ever since the creation of the State of Israel, there's been very, very few times, in fact, that left-leaning, liberal-leaning politicians are gained prominence in the Knesset. This signifies one thing and one thing only. The fact that majority of people in Israel does identify themselves as Jewish and wants to see the Knesset being dictated by Jewish policies and want Israel to be known as a Jewish identity. Now, when they themselves see themselves as a Jewish identity, how should then they represent themselves? That is a crucial question that opening opposition will answer and ultimately win this debate with. Ladies and gentlemen, there are two issues that I'd like to handle today. Firstly, what is the scenario in which we are likely to facilitate acceptance in region where distrust is prevalent? And secondly, why is it necessary for the state of Israel to have a Jewish identity? But before that, a few points of rebuttal towards a few things that we've heard from Kanna. Because he says that the people on the ground in Israel do not want far-right policies. But that's completely not true. The fact that Knesset have been dominated by Likud party and by slightly less right politicians is indicative that people feel that they are under attack, especially in terms of situation where their international standing is being threatened due to the recognition of Palestinians by other people, for example. Because they feel themselves threatened, more and more people want to put forth their identity, their existence, and their sense of belonging to be acknowledged by the entire world. Now, why is it this sense of belonging is so entirely crucial to this debate on whether or not Jewish identity is in fact crucial? Because if you represent yourself as a secular state, you are completely stripping the entire history and the characteristic of your existence as a nation. Because you have to acknowledge the impetus for the creation of the state of Israel is primarily derived from the impetus of the Jewish people to have a Jewish nation, to have a nation in which their rights and their identities are prominent within that so-called territory. If you have a completely secular institution in which Jewish identity are in fact not prioritized or are falsely misrepresented on international scales, it's far more likely that people aren't going to trust you because you are not being forthcoming with your identity, because you are not embedding the structure of your preference of Jewish identity into your official structure, which makes it far harder for changes of liberalization or democratization to occur later on, because these things are, even though they are not institutionalized, they are harder to tackle on because they are in fact not institutionalized. But let's move on to the second part of rebuttal. A second part of rebuttal, because the sympathy card, because of Jewish identity, for example. Actually, I'll just tackle this in my issues. Let's move on towards my issue. What is the best scenario in which we are likely to facilitate acceptance of identities? To declare themselves as a Jewish state or to not declare as a Jewish state? We first have to acknowledge there are multiple instances of negotiation that have been going on. For example, we say when it comes to this negotiation, it is better for Israel to be forthcoming of what actually they stand and what actually they reflect when they come towards the negotiation table. Now, what does this mean actually? It essentially means when you come to the negotiation table, you actually be clear as to what you actually want to be recognized by the other side. Do you exactly, when at the end of this treaty, for example, do you still want Jewish identity to be recognized or for it to be thrown out? That doesn't happen if you don't declare it, because it's never been brought into the negotiation table. The terms of that agreement will still be fairly ambiguous, and we think that ambiguity is harmful, because in the end you have to give it to the people on the ground later on to decide by means, I don't know, by means of violence or by means of ethnic and civil conflict. We think that this kind of ambiguity is best, we think this sort of confirmation has to occur early on before reconciliation occur after the agreement has been made. I agree, the creation of a Jewish state, the declaration, official recognition of a Jewish state makes treaty much harder to come to an agreement with. But that's good, because if an agreement is based on ambiguity as regard to status of the people, it's far more harmful towards the people, because people have to resolve these conflicts on their own later on. But let's move on to the second issue. Sit down, Kanna. Why is it necessary for Israel to have a Jewish identity? These are the parts of Alya's speech that have been completely ignored by Kanna's. Because necessarily we have talked, for example, it is necessary to have the Jewish identity because it provides for constitutional mechanisms to prefer a Jewish guy as opposed to an Arab guy when they enter into our country. What does this mean in actual terms? For example, we are able to prioritize Jews who are in fact running from persecution in Iraq and Syria over an Arab dude who just wants to enter from Lebanon, for example. These are the sorts of crucial things that are important in order to facilitate and minimize persecution of other Jews in other countries. But moving on to that, it also provides preferences in terms of housing. It also provides the ability of certain villages and certain communities to maintain a Jewish identity, something which is not available if you declare yourself as a completely secular country. Yes, Kanna?
That is a false dichotomy. Having a secular state doesn't mean you can't accommodate Jewish interests, especially those of the region or within your own state, or entirely lose your heritage.
No, because we have to agree that secular state basically wants everyone to be treated equally. But we don't want we don't want that for the Jews, because the Jews have suffered intergenerational losses that deserve to be compensated at this particular instance. That we don't mind for them to be given preference over other ethnicities. But let's not exaggerate the kind of infringement of rights of that Arabs are suffering right now. Even now, they have Arab lawmakers in Knesset. They have education up until the tertiary education. But more than that, they have also have the option to escape to other countries in which their identities and religion are not only accepted but are celebrated and are preferred in other countries. We think that that opting out that opting out clause is only available towards the Arab, but not necessarily the Israelis if Israel don't declare itself as a Jewish identity. Ladies and gentlemen, when we're talking about whether or not on how we want to progress beyond the statement that we currently have, we have to acknowledge the difficult situation that we are currently in. Yes, none of them are currently budging right now. But to lie towards the international community just because that you may have sympathy will only degrade the kind of support that you'll have later on when you want to make those policies work in actual terms. Even if they will support you when it comes to reaching that agreement, the kind of support that we will receive in making that agreement work will be much, much harder to be accrued. Ladies and gentlemen, for all of these reasons, go with OO.
Mr. Speaker, I really do not know what opening opposition is on about, because this victim mentality that apparently necessitates a Jewish state can't run in any debate, let alone this one. The mentality that they run is that we've been victims and we've been oppressed, and thus the label of being called a Jewish state emboldens us, gives us this form of artificial superiority that we need to run our lives, and at the expense of many other nations, because we now have a right to oppress. What they fail to understand is that your need to compensate for that victim mentality comes at the expense of oppressing other people, and when you're labeled as a Jewish state, we find that a problem. Israel, from the perspective of the international community, is the antagonist as a Jewish state. They've been imploring this artificial sense of superiority amongst other people like Syria and Iran, where they want to blow them off the face of the earth. The religious differences that they have been used as a political tool to wage war. They are currently unwilling to make concessions, and they've broken initiatives to make concessions as a Jewish state. These are the types of labels and these are the types of perceptions that need to change over time, and I'm going to bring you 3 extensions. The first, why there's a subliminal impact on perception that needs to change as far as the Jewish state is concerned, and why this is unfair to the Israelites on the ground. Secondly, why the religious moral authority currently that stands on opening opposition model as the Jewish states tend to isolate different forms of religious factions and people that don't belong to the Jewish state mentality. And thirdly, why this is the first step to create a minimal form of concession, because as far as I'm concerned, or the rest of us are concerned, any form of concessions that we've asked Israel to make that have been tangible have reached a dead end. So why this is the first step to those kinds of minimalist concessions? First rebuttal. They tell us that this is the compensation for oppression. Unfortunately, the dynamics in which the Jewish state is viewed as now have naturally changed over time. By far and large, according to most parts of the world, they're the ones who naturally antagonize their oppressors. They are the ones who are occupying the West Bank and Gaza. So I'm sorry, the victim mentality doesn't stand. Then they want a safe haven to practice your religion. Cool, but that could also apply in the converse where we don't have a Jewish state, and we think that's fine. But what we heard from the speaker before me were 2 things: that the ambiguity that exists is a problem, and therefore secularism creates that ambiguity where you can't find an identity. What we never heard was the implications of that to the Jewish people or people that generally live in Israel. Creating that ambiguous form of identity as far as a nation is concerned, what were the natural harms or the impacts that it has on the ground? Because we tell you the converse of being continuously labeled as a Jewish state has its harms. Lastly, they told us we need to minimize persecution, and this is good public policy. But why does your minimizing of persecution come at the expense of artificially amplifying your superiority as a Jewish state? Why can't we minimize the persecution knowing Israelites as people in general who have either done wrong or done right? But the intergenerational losses that they want to talk about, you're using unwillingness to cooperate as an accommodation for that failure. But secondly, you're fine with at the expense of breeding religious animosities amongst the people within Israel and also internationally as well. So we think as much as you want to minimize persecution, and this is good for public policy, it's not good for Israel in the long run. First extension. Why is there subliminal impact on perception? One, we think there's a huge amount of guilt by association that you accrue to every other Jew who's got nothing, who's not got anything to want to do with the state that he comes from. There's a subliminal representation that is implored on every single Jewish person out there, regardless of whether you come from Israel or otherwise, that you are now a representative of the animosity and the breeding of guilt that your state has naturally accrued. These are the unnecessary types of xenophobia that we employ to people. Take a Malay student who's studying in the UK, and you immediately label that student as leeching off the state who's been given all the Bhumiputra benefits that he or she has never deserved. These are the unnecessary types of labeling that we place on people because they come from that state, and it's guilt by association that shouldn't be employed on these people. Secondly, we tell you there's an interpretation of being naturally self-serving, because by being known as a Jewish state, the way they've been running things have naturally been self-serving to the point where they feel entitled to their right to oppress. They feel the right to isolate people and different factions that don't necessarily resonate with their forms of ideologies. And we've seen the continuous oppression that they naturally employ. The only reasoning for this, we're Jews and we employ ourselves because we've got the numbers to back it up. These are the types of self-entitlement and self-serving oppression that cannot naturally exist. But lastly, what kind of discourse will we naturally create? When you look at public policy to begin with, 2 days ago, the Israel community wanted to pass a state Jewish bill that would naturally create some sort of equality for race and religion and all that jazz. The amount of backlash that's naturally been happening is that we don't want these forms of equality because we've got the numbers and majority of our people are generally Jewish. These are the types of resonances that continuously linger when it comes to the public policy discourse. When you continue to amplify the idea that we are known as a Jewish state and therefore we will not accommodate any alternate ideologies. But as far as foreign policy is concerned, the reason why it's so difficult to talk to Israel or make any forms of compromise is because they've been emboldened by the artificial superiority of being known as a Jewish state. Absence of that, the kind of discourse that you have, you can create a far better amount of compromise because you don't have that labeling where you're artificially more superior than everyone else just because you are a Jew. Secondly, while we think that religious moral authority isolates factions even further, by being labeled as a Jewish state, there is a need as a Jew to continuously feel that you need to protect your own from everyone else. The kind of resonance and the kind of protection or accommodation that actually exists by being called as a Jewish state doesn't necessarily accommodate those different factions, especially within the Jewish community before 6 anyone.
Okay, let's talk about the recognition. The only reason why they did all these actions is so that they can be recognized by the people. If you can at least give them what they want, at least you moderate these Israelis, and there will be less oppression on the
Yeah, but the moderation is further worsened and exacerbated and becomes far more difficult when you're labeled as a Jewish state. What you need to provide to us is that moderation can still exist by providing that label, and that there's a net value benefit of that label still existing as we move along. So more on this. There is a direct imperative by being a Jewish state, by being emboldened by that artificial superiority, to continuously isolate non-Jewish factions in these instances, especially when it comes to public policy, given the backlash of the state bill. And we think that's unfair. Lastly, while we think this is a first step to minimal concessions to be made, when you look at the kind of compromises that have been asked of Israel towards Palestine, of Israel towards Iran, they've naturally been unwilling to compromise because these are tangible forms of compromises that they feel are antagonistic to them as a particular Jewish state. You breed hatreds towards the Jews. These are unfair forms of implications that the Jewish community is unwilling to compromise with Palestine, that the Jewish community is unwilling to make accommodations with Iran. This is a long-term good when you disassociate yourself without that guilt of association by being a Jew, that you don't form that resonance and accommodations because your state is belligerent and a bastard in the eyes of the international community. Proud to propose.
We next invite the opposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, we believe that the oppression done by the Israelis towards the
Palestinians have been prolonged for such a long time already. We think these atrocities should stop, right? This debate is about whether or not which sides will confer more benefits to people on the ground. Our burden in today's debate is to prove to you that by declaring Israel as a Jewish state will moderate the government of Israel as a whole, right? But before I move on to my substantives, let's take a look at what side closing government have told you about. He told you three things. Firstly, how there will be subliminal impact on perception. We believe that this perception is good because this is exactly what they wanted in the first place. People in Israel want to be regarded as Jewish, want to be regarded that they live in a Jewish state for such a long time already. When we grant them this status, then we believe that we will moderate them on the grounds later because they have been wanting this. They've been wanting this Jewish state for such a long time already. But secondly, he told us about how there will be religious morality and will somehow isolate factions even further, right? But we tell you this already happened under status quo, where Israelis are isolating themselves from other states within the West Bank area because they wanted to establish themselves as a dominant state, as an Israeli state, right? So, under our side, we believe that it is better because when we grant them this title of Jewish state, they will then moderate them later. But thirdly, he told you that this is the first step to making concessions. We believe that when we grant them, there will be no hatred that what he claimed it to be. We believe that we have the reasonable. We believe that by granting them this Jewish state, it will moderate them on the ground. Later, right? No, thank you. But let's take a walk down the history lane, ladies and gentlemen, because let's take a look at the historical background of in the West Bank, right? Because the Israelis always want to be recognized as to live in a Jewish state. They want to have their Jewish states, right? We believe that there's a lot of conflicts already accrued on the grounds, ladies and gentlemen. They constantly want to declare themselves as a righteous owner of the land since God knows centuries ago. So Jewish are always in a state of unrest because they want to be prominent in that very area, right? So that is why they constantly build walls to make their area even larger and even further, right? From lands around them. That is why there's a lot of violations that's already happening between them and also Israelis and also the Palestinians, right? So we need to acknowledge this conflict has always been present within the proximity around Israelis and also Palestine, right? So we acknowledge that a lot of violation of human rights and also a violation of human rights have already materialized, and until right now there are 146 violations of international law that have been violated by the Israelis. We believe that when we grant them the status of a Jewish state, it will moderate them later. Because OG main concern is only on this idea of cultural supremacy, right? Because these Jews are already. We believe that because these Jews are already battling and antagonizing people on the ground, and when you legitimize them even more, and they will moderate them, because then when you grant the status, violation will then be hampered and stopped, right? No, thank you. But let's take a move. Let's move on to my substantive in today's debate. I have two levels of analysis. My first argument is we believe that moderation will garner benefits to the majority. I have two levels of analysis, how this will benefit the people in the state of Israel and also the international community, right? How do we best moderate this people? Because what happens on the ground is there are ethnic cleansing being done by the Israelis. There's a lot of violation human rights have been done. If we allow them to declare themselves as a Jewish state, we will moderate them even better. A lot more discourse will then happen between Israelis and also the international community. What will happen now, they're willing to engage between the international community and to international community. They will give rights to people and there will be less oppression on the grounds, because no one wants to support this idea of Jewish state in the first place. And we believe that many many opposition, especially from the Muslim community, we believe that when we grant them this Jewish state, it will moderate them later. But before I move on to my second substantive closing,
I think you got the debate very wrong. This isn't about granting them the Jewish status. This is about the oppression and all the harms that they have been.
That also happens under
their Jewish state.
that also still happen under our substantive, because we tell you when you allow them, we will not granting them, because a lot of people have been dissenting this idea of granting them the title of Jewish state. When you allow them to have this title of Jewish state, there will then people will be more accepting and willing to accept them, right? So secondly, on the my second level of analysis, how it will be better for the international community, right? Because we believe that Israel have already done a lot of violations of international humanitarian law, especially towards the Palestinians, right? Up to now, there's already 146 of violations of international humanitarian law, because they always want this recognition, right? There's always been opposed by the international community. But how do we stop this? It is by giving them what they want, because the Muslims especially claim that the West Bank is their home. There's a lot of disputes between wanting to establishing themselves as a Jewish state, or even a state for the three Abrahamic religion as a whole, right? So we believe that it is unsafe, because a lot of these Jews are being antagonized by everyone, and when we grant them this status, it will moderate them at the end of the day. So now the land is heavily populated with Jewish people, so it's strategic to call themselves as a Jewish state. This is important, so we can engage, and there will be more tolerant and lax into moderating, right? This is important. So now the Israelis doesn't want to oppress or they won't show authority to secure their influence on the land. So, ladies and gentlemen, we under our side of the house, we care for the people on the ground, and we give them the title of Jewish state. The people will not be oppressed any longer. Ladies and gentlemen, we believe. Wait a minute. To stop more oppression and also ethnic cleansing, we believe that on people being killed, side Marah will give you moderation and confers benefit to both sides. We give the best of both worlds. Go with side Marah.
Thank you, opposition member, for the last speech from side government, by CEO.
It's ironic that the path to closure and in moving forward and reconciliation is by victim playing to justify the antagonism and the crimes of annexation that you're doing against the Palestinian. We tell you that that's what this side of the house wants to do. In OG, they talked about the perception of Israel from a secularist point of view and how it benefits them to be seen as a legitimate agent in this current conflict. The stance from closing government has been very clear. It's a perception from the international community as well as to why Israel needs to remove the official labeling and why it's beneficial to the Israelites. And Tim talked to you about the subliminal impact that this has to the perception. He also talked to you about the isolation of religions and the step to concession and how it's the first step to concession, something that will go on a little bit more in my substantive. Now, I've got two questions in today's debate. First thing, Israel as a bastion of Jews around the world, something that they want to talk about. And secondly, the value of identity and whether or not relinquishing identity is the step to moderation or maintaining identity as a form of moderation. Now let's look at the first thing. Israel is a bastion of Jews around the world, because opening opposition tells you that Israel is the refuge hub. It can ratify constitutions to provide refugee status or refugee needs for any Jews around the world. Thirdly, they tell you it's a motivation because Jews around the world will feel happy because, even if I'm persecuted, there's always Israel to go to. But we tell you that, one, it's irrelevant because the identity and the ability to be altruistic to Jews around the world is not necessarily mutually exclusive. You can still care about Jews around the world without having to serve the very identity that you have. But secondly, it disregards and simplifies the complexity and the plights of Jews around the world who are persecuted, because there are multiple reasons for persecution as well. And we think it's really unfair for you to just say, this might solve all your problems of discrimination in Jews around the world. But more importantly, this guy said They want to create an India-Pakistan issue because if you're Arab and you're discriminated, you can go to the Arab countries, but if you're Jewish and you're discriminated, you can go to Jew. We tell you the solution is not very simple because it's about embracing diversity even in multifaceted or multicultural societies, ladies and gentlemen. We think that migrating this to some safe havens doesn't magically give you or facilitate the acceptance that Audi especially want to talk about in his speech. But then he tells you your identity allows you then to actively discriminate who gets to come into Israel and who doesn't, regardless of your plight or regardless of your actual problems. We tell you that that's the sort of institutionalized racism that your identity currently gives you. The converse happens under our situation. We tell you that moderation doesn't exist, but we tell you, more importantly, this creates this guilt by association that team especially talked to you about. That if you're Jewish, regardless of where you are, it's reflective of the actions of Israel with regards to the antagonism that's already been done in society. Jews across Arabs are also vilified, and the excuse that a lot of them do is because of Israel and because of Israel's actions against antagonism against Israel. We tell you that this sort of institutionalized xenophobia exists especially when you are subservient or when you feel that you have to serve a singular identity and especially a religious identity. I'm moving on to my second idea, the value of identity and whether or not whether moderation is formed by the relinquishing of identity, something that we want to talk about, or by maintaining your current identity. Now, the question is this. When it comes to identity, we've recognized the value of identity. But the thing is, when should concessions be made? And especially how this really doesn't affect the way that Jews live their life within Israel as well. Because the characterization from this side of the house tells you that it's not declaring that your religious crusade makes you less trustworthy, makes you ambiguous, and somehow any agreements that you somehow form will suffer from a lack of clarity. We tell you these are logical leaps that already exist here, because your identity as a Jewish state, more importantly, becomes the overarching identity of your statehood. It's the cause of the current antagonism with regards to Palestine. Any act against Israel is a war against Jews around the world. And that's what they're justifying it, because I'm Jewish and I represent the Jewish identity. So if you wage war against Israel, you're waging war against all Jews around the world. And that's why lobby groups in the US is very strong, because of the very identity or the very sort of exploitation of this religious rhetoric that's already been placed. We tell you that there's also are deemed the superiority ambassadors, because one, they're seen to be serving only Jews around the world. Number two, they've got the numbers, and three, they've got the backings, and all of these are found on the foundation of the overarching identity of statehood. And we tell you that this then justifies the immorality of the land seizures, something that CEO wanted to talk about, and we tell you that that's not going to exist on that side of the house. But then, more importantly, this leads to a reference point in regards to policy making, because if you have an overarching identity of your statehood, everything that you do will then want to serve the overarching identity, i.e. your Jewish interests. Like you already see in Malaysia, the moment we started labeling ourselves the Islamic State because we wanted to get into OIC, we tell you that then policies that we start to generate always look at, are we serving the Islamic interest? So much so that we legitimize any policies based on these emotional barriers. Things like Ultraman, for instance, or not touching dogs, because everything is, does this serve the Islamic interest as opposed to rational discussion as well. And it's the same sort of reference point that you already see with Jewish policies, because anything that they do is always seen as, does this serve the Jewish interest? With regards to this, we think that relinquishing this and shakes the current conception of artificial superiority that already exists. But this is why you need to moderate. Before I explain why moderation will exist better on our side, yes.
How will you stop the oppression done by the Israelis to stop Israelis on the ground from being vilified and antagonized for the things they've done?
We'll tell you why moderation is better served on our side, but we tell you that having a Jewish identity, if anything, reinforces the need for you to continuously antagonize or continuously to crouch into Palestine land, ladies and gentlemen. And we tell you that's more existent under your side of the house. But why is relinquishing this, how relinquishing this would be more moderate? Because one, the idea of an identity, as much as it's there, it's something that you live your life around. It's intangible as far as an overarching, as far as people on the ground is concerned, for an overarching identity of a statehood. But you can still serve the Jews regardless, even if you remove the idea of the identity. You remove that self-reference point that becomes the justification for all of these that this side of the house wants to argue. And it also promotes some form of subliminal changes that you see, because your current generation may not feel it and may have very strong Jewish sentiments, but your future generations will also be more receptive towards other form of races, other form of religions, because you remove that reference points and your policy making no longer justified by these reference points. But thirdly, Tim also talked to you about how they create incremental concession, because as far as the eyes of the international community is concerned, there's no breakthrough that can be done in Israel, because anything that's tangible is always deemed against violence, or it's also deemed to be a huge threat for them. This is the first step to concession, because the very relinquishing of his identity shows some form of openness or some form of willingness to do this. And we tell you that incremental concessions is the way to go, especially given the protracted situation that you already have with Israel-Palestine, having this on for decades. Ladies and gentlemen, having this is an incremental concession that you do, because you can't make changes overnight, especially with a situation as sensitive as this. With that, I thank you.
Thank you. I have the last speech on this page. We invite
Okay. Mr. Speaker, so hallelujah, we finally found a way to moderate all these Jews, and side closing government doesn't want to engage with us. We think it's shameful of them and we do not accept that. So let's talk about the debate and why Mahirah's characterization is very important. She talks about how do we best moderate this Israeli government, because we see that there's a lot of operations on the ground, there's a lot of violations that happen because they found a necessity to fight to show that who is the most dominant group within that state. This happens because you refuse to recognize them as the Jewish state, and that's why moderation will never happen under their paradigm, because you will never give them the recognition, and they will have to always keep fighting and push these people away so that they will be recognized in the end. So let's talk about Mahirah's point. She talked about how important it is to have the recognition by the people, because these Jewish have been lobbying for years to get the recognition for what they are. They are Jewish and they have never been shameful to hide it. When they want to take Jerusalem, they use the Jewish card as the point why Jerusalem belongs to them. They have never recognized themselves as a secular state. They call themselves as a Jewish state, and so we don't think that it is problematic for us to solidify the fact that they talk about it themselves. And also, the fact is that they resent the fact that they are minorities to cater within that state. So oppression occurs because they want these minorities to move out. That's the reason why they put a lot of pressure on the Muslims, so that these people feel pressure to go out of the state, and that's the reason why oppression occurs. And now Mahirah told you about how these people are less willing to engage in granting more rights to the minorities, because now they feel the need to keep fighting and they feel the need to show who are the most dominant people in that state. So now that under our paradigm, they have no need to impose their influence to show that they are more dominant, because everyone knows now who are the most dominant people in that state. Secondly, now granting rights no longer become a tool for people of other religion to distract the Jews, because now people have to respect that they are indeed the one who controls the state. So now less violation will occur, and we appreciate that. And also, we think this will create a betterment for the people on the ground, because at least you are not oppressed, because you draw the boundaries in which you know who's guarding the state, and that's why now the Jews will be comfortable in their zone, and they will be more willing to engage, they are willing to give out more rights, they are willing to show less oppression opening.
Look, one, they are already a Jewish state right now. We haven't seen any moderation happen, and this is only contribute to increase and legitimize hostile actions from neighbors surrounding Israel.
Let's talk about that. So they want to talk about how once you legitimize this Jewish state, suddenly everyone will want to attack this Jewish state, because now it legitimizes hostile actions from neighboring countries. So why is this false? Because we don't think that just because they call themselves a Jewish state, everyone will start attacking them, because we have to admit that the Jews have the support of other countries like the United States. And also, these neighboring countries are also under the scrutiny of other countries. And thirdly, and the most important point, is that because they carry the branding of Islam. So now if they attack a newly formed Jewish state, it will legitimize the narrative that Islam is indeed a terrorist religion that wants to eradicate everyone else, and that's the most unstrategic thing that they will do. So Muslims already have a bad record in the international platform. When we look at Iraq, when we look at Iran and Syria, we see a lot of rogue state, and that's the reason, and that's the kind of perception that they want to move away from. So that's why they work so hard to show that they are a peaceful religion. So now, because now it will counter the narrative that they are indeed terrorists, and it will garner empathy from them
to the international community to be accepted. So now let's talk about how if they attack a newly formed Jewish state, now it will strengthen the terrorism narrative. And now secondly, it will create a even more condemnation as a whole by the international platform. We don't think that they will opt into attacking a newly formed Jewish state because it will be very unstrategic to them. It will garner condemnation by the international platform to them. And now, under our paradigm, it is better because they have more incentive to establish good relationship with a Jewish state. Why? Because now, firstly, this will elevate the status of them as an Islamic state that wants to eradicate other religion. And secondly, now you have better negotiations formed because these people are more accepting of their status as a Jewish state and are still more willing to negotiate with these people. So you create better negotiations under our paradigm because you are accepting of their status. So we think they have every incentive to establish good relationship with a newly formed Jewish state. So sit down. So let's talk about the opening government's case. How they talk about how it is better for them to declare themselves as a secular state because it becomes easier for us to engage with them, and also how it creates a cultural supremacy if not. So he already conceded to the fact that it doesn't affect us or them, no matter what are they, secular or a Jewish state. So we think that it is more strategic if you call them a Jewish state. Because let's look at their actions. To secure Jerusalem, they call themselves a Jewish state. They play the Jewish card. So they identify themselves as the Jewish, and everyone knows that. So we don't think there's a problem in solidifying that fact. So they want to talk about cultural supremacy. So what? We don't care if there will be more Jewish declarations on the ground or the legislation will benefit the Jews. But what we care about when there are a lot of oppressions on the ground and we are willing to take this trade-off if it means that the Israel will be more moderate and will grant them more rights, because at least under our side, we uphold and elevate the human right on the ground. Sit down. So, and also, why is it false that it will be harder to engage with them under our paradigm? Because we have never used religion as a reason why we should not intervene. When Bashar al-Assad tried to eradicate the Sunni, the United States wants to intervene. When the IS kills on the name of Sunni to establish a caliphate regime, everyone wants to intervene, and even the United States start giving airstrikes. So just because they associate themselves as a religious state doesn't necessarily mean that we cannot intervene on them. In fact, we can always still do so if there is a lot of violation of human rights on the ground. If we see that they are abusing their own people, then we can always still go in, and it doesn't lessen the engagement under our paradigm. So what have Mahirah talked to you about? Mahirah proved to you on how we better moderate these people if you give them what they want, so that at least they can be comfortable with it and they are more ready to engage and give more rights. And I proved to you why the arguments of the government side fall, so we take this debate.